Diversity Thunder Bay had a sold-out audience for a super talk today at the Italian Cultural Center.
I now have the great honor to welcome to the stage Dr. Roshan Danesh.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you, Elder Selena, for starting us off the right way today. I also want to acknowledge the territory of the Anishinaabe peoples and the Fort William First Nation. So happy to be able to be with you. My first time here in Thunder Bay, so am I seeing the best of Thunder Bay here today? It seems wonderful to be with all of you. I really want to acknowledge Diversity Thunder Bay and thank them for the invitation and the sponsors and really acknowledge, 18th, 19th event, noting the International Day for the elimination of racial discrimination, which I know is being marked around the world on March 21st. And of course this year there's a special focus on the International Convention for the 60th anniversary of the International Convention for the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. One of those international treaties in the aftermath of World War II that were really about world powers and peoples around the world trying to uplift patterns of human rights and cohesion. Much of the work that you're trying to do here at a community level. So really honored to be able to be here and share a few reflections with all of you. I should just say 2 words more about my own background and how I ended up being here, because my roots in this country don't run very deep. My mother was born to a Jewish family in the Midwest of the United States. My father was born in a Muslim family in a village in northern Iran. I somehow was born in a Baha'i family in the west coast on Vancouver Island. So I'm a first-generation Canadian. All the rest of my family from Iran came to this country as refugees during the revolution that occurred in Iran. I've had a very fortunate path. I spent many years and still do working on issues of international conflict and violence and so forth, and I'll speak a little bit about that. But also had the great fortune for the last 2 decades to be working domestically to learn from and work alongside Indigenous peoples and leaders and really be taught by them. My main teacher being the one sitting over here, Joey Wilson-Raybould. She continues to school me every day in varied ways. So if I say anything wrong, you may. If you see her go like this, you probably know what that means during the course of the talk. I was asked to give this talk some months ago, and we have to be honest, the context has changed a little bit since I was asked. And I imagine, like me, I normally don't talk with images, but I thought in a room of this nature, there won't be words up there really, it'll just be images mostly. I thought it might be good to acknowledge the fact that we probably come into this room with a fair bit of anxiety, a fair bit of trepidation, a fair bit of uncertainty, maybe feeling a bit of paralysis about what's going on and what should our response be and what to do, both at the community level and as individuals, but then also how we should react to global events. I remember the last time that we had a moment like this, but it was different 5 years ago in the early months of the pandemic. I remember looking on social media and seeing this phrase from one of those ancient Greeks flying around, people sending it around, and the phrase from one of those old philosophers was, "Nothing in the affairs of men is worthy of great anxiety." And whenever I saw it, I wondered if they remembered something else that same ancient Greek philosopher said, which is, "The price good men pay for indifference to public affairs is to be ruled by evil men." So I thought I should fold into our comments and our reflections today a bit of broader reflection on how we understand this moment of time we're in. A few thoughts on that and what that means for what our response to it might be as individuals, collectively as communities, and what that means for what you're doing here in Thunder Bay, building cohesion building bonds of unity, trying to build new forms of identity and relations with each other. So with that in mind, the first question that I put up here, how should we understand, how can we understand this moment in time that we're in? And very simply, when I talk about the moment in time where we want, it feels like we are once in the midst of pulling together and pulling apart. And that we're all kind of stuck. You know, when you see things pulling together and pulling apart at once. And what do? Where do you go? How do you respond to that? And not only is that we both feel we're pulling together and pulling apart, but it's the same forces, the same things, the same realities that are doing that to us. So I didn't bring my phone up here, but you know, the digital age and social media, the Twitters and Facebooks, on the one hand, a massive force, of course, of pulling us together, transcend time, space, boundaries, I mean, all the obvious things that you know. But at the same time, we know that they are at the root of the epidemic of pulling us apart, not just in that they isolate from us from one another and create an epidemic of loneliness that societies are now facing because we're all preoccupied with ourselves on our phones, but also that they become the main vehicle for surfacing forms of hate and division and hardening those as they reinforce it time and again. Or you can look at other examples, the same thing, the same reality, the same entity at once, pulling us together and pulling us apart. The response to the pandemic, you might remember the early months of it, this wave of mutuality and love thy neighbor. We have to take care of each other is the only way to respond, a collective action, feeling and emotion and reality that came out of it. Now, the lineage of that time, some of the forces that we see at place in the world, the divisions, the ruptures, the political divides, can be traced back to divides that because of the different responses to that time. Loss and erosion in scientific, trust in public institutions, trust in science, trust in knowledge, all of these things, again, dividing us apart, the same things pulling us apart. Even in a different example, you know, well, if you want a more perspective on what's happening in the world today, Jody published an op-ed in the Toronto Star this morning on how, if you want to know how to deal with Trump, listen to Indigenous people because they've been dealing with Trumps throughout the history of Canada. So you may want to check out that article. But when we went on a book tour in November, early on in it, we wrote an op-ed about residential school denialism because the report of the interlocutor and so forth had come out. And of course, like, this is a micro example of what I'm talking about, but you know, that moment in 2021 at Kamloops with the announcement and the response and the pulling together that seemed to be occurring. Well, when we published that article, I mean, she faces a lot of online activity, but I think that without a doubt was the most hate-filled, racist-filled, anger-filled set of responses that you can imagine. Again, the same events, the same realities, at once seem like a force of pulling together, and at another time a force of pulling apart. This pulling together, pulling apart, when I talk about this moment in time, this is not a new thing, right? We can look back over the last few hundred years and see that there's been paradoxical forces of integration and disintegration happening all at once. If you look back over time, I'm not going to give some big boring history lesson in narrative, right? But the story of the last few hundred years can be told as the story of, look at this room, right? Peoples, communities forming where they couldn't exist before and they didn't exist before. A coming together of peoples from across the globe, an interaction, new forms of interaction, new families being formed, new patterns being formed, new types of community, the meaning of community changing. Of course, new sciences and technologies that reinforce that. We can talk about new patterns of, like, the convention of the International Day of Elimination of Racial Discrimination, things that reflect a integration and a response to the integration and reality of integration in our lives. And at the same time, the story of those years is of the most destructive, the most war-filled, the most globally war-filled, the greatest weaponry to destroy human life, forms of colonization and racism, reinvented and re-intensified in new ways, all sorts of forms of disintegration. And as part of that disintegration, our public institutions that look south of the border increasingly seem to be collapsing, unable to respond to the realities of this time, unable to respond. In this regard, look at something like climate change, for example, right? And the ability of our public institutions to respond to that reality. You have an integrative challenge, climate change. You can't solve it alone. It requires all of us. And you have the complete impotence of public institutions. They are not the right ones to be able to address this, not the right forms of learning. So the question, though, that I wanted to touch on is, what leads us to pull together versus pull apart? Why does your neighbor who you loved and respected somehow in the pandemic, you now see them on Twitter or X or whatever it is, saying things you never thought they would say, pulling apart, right? Why do some choose pulling together? Let me tell you a story just to illustrate this, and then we'll talk about why or how or what the mechanics are, what we have to do to pull together. This was an experience from another part of the world, a part of a project that I was involved in. This was in Bosnia. So Bosnia suffered was the site of a very destructive war in the 1990s, a site of ethnic cleansing of the Bosniak Muslim population, a site where there were parts of that which have been labeled genocide in particular areas. It was a very violent, very destructive, neighbor-on-neighbor type of war. If you look at maps of that area before the war broke out, it would be like this room, people living all intertwined. And then all of a sudden it broke into a very violent situation. The story, and I'm only going to tell you half the story now because the punchline will come later on, but the story was after the war, as part of reconstruction in one area that had been the site of the worst atrocities in this war, the events had occurred that they were going to lay the stone for rebuilding a mosque that had been destroyed. And so this was a major milestone and a major turning point. And so the whole international community was being brought in to celebrate this moment and this change, that this community that had been the site of ethnic cleansing, the site of massive war crimes, the site of great destruction, that this was going to take place. What happened at that event is that those from the ethnic group that didn't really want this to happen, they closed the schools, the high schools, that day. And they incited the students to become a mob, including by handing out alcohol and other things. And they wanted them to go and chase the international community out and stop the event for laying the foundation for the mosque. And that's what happened. Except one school, the students refused. They kept the school open. They refused to incite the mob, be part of the mob. And they condemned what was happening, not just by their actions, but by their words. Why? What leads some to pull together, while others to pull apart? Why did those kids make that choice? How can we be those kids versus the other kids? What do we have to do that? Jody's previous book, which is also for sale, I see it at the back, I'm doing a little plug, it was all based on the question that she said she gets asked more than any other question, which is, what can I do? This is a pull together. What can I do to be an agent, a force of change and reconciliation? People yearning to ask, feeling a bit paralyzed, but how do we do it? Asking the what can we do to pull together question. So that's what I want to spend the rest of my time talking about, is two practices that we have to do to pull together. One is more collective in nature. It's about all of you, all of us collectively. And one is more individual in nature. So the collective one. This is a statement from George Erasmus. Do any of you know who George, yeah, some of you. George Erasmus is a Dene leader. He was one of the commissioners of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. He just wrote his life story. The name of the book is Hota, and you should definitely read it. It's a remarkable book. I think he's touring around it right now. And this statement, which is actually a statement when we were writing Reconciling History, we had almost finished the book and then we found this statement. And we said, well, that's the whole book, so we stuck it at the beginning. So it's the opening of the book, is this statement. And he says, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. Where community is to be formed, common memory must be created. Now, there's a lot of things in this statement that I want to touch on. One of the main things he's talking about are the visible and invisible silos that in this context, colonization that he's talking about builds up between peoples. Now the visible silos, you all know, you see them. Even if you're not always conscious of them, you see them when you're moving on reserve land, off reserve land, when you see them in what is often called the socio-cultural gap that colonization has created, and the differences that we see in relation to housing or poverty and so on. You see those visible silos. You know, I live on a part of Vancouver Island. It's one of the richest places in the country, this southern tip of Vancouver Island. It's beautiful, of course. And as it happens, because of history, if you drive one of the most beautiful roads along the coast, for those of you who've taken the ferry and landed, if you don't go on the main highway, you'll go a side road that's beautiful. But you can drive it along the coast. But as you do it, you're going on and off reserve from multi-million-dollar houses onto reserve and then off. And you can tell well, you shouldn't drive with your eyes closed, but if you were just listening and feeling, you can feel when you've gone on and off reserve, because the roads are nicely paved and smooth when you're off reserve, and when you're on the federal government and it gets complicated legally and so forth, but they haven't been taken care of, right? These are the visible silos. He's talking mostly in here about the invisible silos, right? The ones that we don't necessarily see and are conscious of in the same way. And because of that, they can be even more problematic, divisive, and dangerous. And one of the main ones, which I'll talk about in a moment, is the silo of the stories that we tell of who we are. Who Thunder Bay is, who we are as Canadians, who we are as peoples. Let me tell you another story, another experience that illustrates this. This is when I was living in Iqaluit, in Nunavut. Have any of you been there? It's way up there. Much colder than here, believe it or not. But I was up there soon after Nunavut territory formed. The territory was formed in the late 1990s. And one of the things that was focused on, one of them at the time, was there really had not been any Inuit lawyers in the territory ever. So they started the University of Victoria Law School started a satellite law school and developed a program with the community up there, the Inuit peoples up there, to form and run one class of Inuit law students in Nunavut. And the program was somewhat different, it was slightly longer, so forth and so on. So I was sent up there to teach constitutional law to the class. It was 15 students, 13 women, 2 men. They've all since graduated, done remarkable things, and they're active all over Canada in many different ways, and of course home in Nunavut. One day in my class, Well, in the lead up to the class, I got a message that, and I'm going to leave it nameless because he maybe doesn't look the best in this story. One of the most famous political philosophers in Western thought was up there, and he really wanted to meet the law students. The law students were kind of famous; they were kind of celebrities in the capital. And he wanted to come. He was from England, Oxford, Cambridge, one of those. You would know his name if I said it out loud. And he wanted, so I said, sure, come. And he wanted to present a paper to one of his papers. And this is where I'm being really unfair. But the gist of the paper was, he's a liberal political thinker, a liberal democratic. Now that you've formed a territory and you have your own legislative assembly, and you have this form of representative government, aren't we kind of done with the colonization challenges? So he finishes, and the students start murmuring in Inuktitut to each other. I don't know what they're talking about. You can see they're kind of self-organized, right? You can tell that they're deciding who's going to speak. And then a woman gets up. She was kind of considered, and she was the elder of the class. And this is what she says. She says, I have 5 generations living inside of me. My grandmother, who lived on the land and never saw a southerner, which was the term used for everybody else on the planet, but she meant those of European descent specifically in this context. My mother, who was taken off the land and forced to live in a settlement. Me, who was taken away from my family and put in residential school. My children, she had 2 teenagers at the time, they babysat my daughter while we were up there. My teenagers who play video games, watch television, and don't know much of what it meant to be Inuit. And my unborn grandchildren, who, if we don't transform this society and this country, will know absolutely nothing of the life of their grandmother and her ways and her culture. And that was all she said. And there was a massive silo, right? This revealed the invisible silo in this room. He didn't comprehend, at least to my knowledge, what she was saying. And she was saying, there's a very different story. And it's not a story that you recognize or share it. There isn't a common memory in this room that allows us to figure out what we need to do now and how to move forward. And this is at the genesis of what Reconciling History is about, that Jody and I wrote last year, is trying to raise this question about what a shared story would look like, how to build that common memory. Telling the story using first-person voices throughout history, but telling the story mostly through an Indigenous worldview and an Indigenous perspective, which I'll talk about and show, as part of building towards that common memory and shared story. This is more for you. I imagine many of you were taught your story of Canada the way I was taught, right? And of course it's changing. There's tremendous work going on in curriculum change and how we teach our children, and the work of Robin at the residential school and learning about that and everything that we've heard. There's massive work. But I'm old, but not that old, right? I was taught the history of Canada, that is the story of a struggle between European powers. And the only time that Indigenous people appear in that story is as an adjunct to that story, right? Either because of a trade relation or a military alliance, as an adjunct to what the Europeans were up to. And the cardinal moment in that story, which of course is around Confederation, never acknowledged that it was one that Indigenous people were simply not present at, we're not a part of, we're not invited to, or as Jody often says, we're out of sight and out of mind of those who are doing it. remains a predominant story that many of us carry around with us, and it affects our institutions and our ways of thinking. The new Prime Minister, this is from Jodi's op-ed this morning that she draws attention to, he went to Europe, right, and he said, we're the most European of the non-European countries, that's who we are. And then she goes on to say in the op-ed, shouldn't we spend more time, when we're under threats, similar to the threats Indigenous peoples felt and experienced throughout history, shouldn't we spend more time listening to those who experienced and responded to those threats rather than those who perpetuated it, right? So the predominant story, and so in the book, right, we undertake some of the effort of telling one example of an Indigenous history and how to take it, much like that woman in the classroom. That student responded to that person. And the way we told the story, you might recognize somebody at the bottom of this totem pole. The book is organized through this totem pole. This is a totem pole from Jodi's community in Kinka Inlet, which the Musqueam Zawadanik people erected in 1936. And they erected it at that time to honor King George V, who had passed away, but also at the same time as a show of defiance, to say, we're here still. Look at us. Look at who we are. And this pole, the book is organized in 4 parts, based on these 4 masks, clans that it represents on the pole. And you're going to have to buy and read the book, I'm afraid, to get all the details. But at the bottom of the pole, again, this is part of telling a story from an Indigenous perspective. And there's many of them. There's shared elements in those, but they're also going to be distinct. This was one distinct to Jodi, her community, her people, her art, her way of representing who they are, their way of representing who they are. At the bottom of the pole is the first ancestor, and in the book, that's the voices that you'll hear of what life was like, the patterns, the traditions, the cultures, the society, the governance prior to any contact with Europeans. Then it moves into the period of the raven, and of course, in many Indigenous cultures, the raven is known as a trickster, right? As something that has both a good and a bad aspect, as being uncertain of what the trickster, what the raven is up to, that you can't be certain. And in this period, you see hopes and expressions of mutuality and mutual cooperation, like the treaties, like the Robinson Superior Treaty or the Treaty of Niagara, the two-row wampum, the exchange of belts to symbolize peoples walking together down a path as one. And then you also see the rise of land alienation, disease, intrusion, economic taking, and so this confusion about what this era, right, the trickster. Then you move into the period of the wolf. And wolves, they often move in packs, they often have to move stealthily, they have to move with caution and with fierceness, and this both evokes the rise of advocacy by First Nations people, but often in the shadows to preserve their cultures, their way of life, their traditions, as well as the era of the great force of the state acting on, and the colonization, the Indian Act, the residential schools, the taking of lands, the interference and banning of forms of government. And you're familiar with many stories of it, but one story that kind of evokes that era of the wolf for me, this rise of advocacy that's coming together, this collective advocacy in the 1920s, many leaders Indigenous leaders from Western Canada, from British Columbia, growing increasingly concerned about children being taken away and the land being taken away. They come to Ottawa and sit down before a joint committee of Parliament, and they say something is really wrong here. And they had petitions, and they had allies who helped them write down and express some of the arguments they want to make, and they presented to that Senate committee. And this was at a time that the collective advocacy is really growing. And the response of the Canadian state was to amend the Indian Act to ban the hiring of lawyers to raise such claims, and to forbid the raising of rights claims, something which remained on the books until 1951. right? So this is the period of the wolf that's told in the book in people's voices. And then the last period is the period we're in now, the period of Thunderbird, which of course reflects ascendancy, and it's often in many cultures is the being of highest spiritual standing and sustenance, but it really speaks to all the R words that we often talk about: resurgence, reconciliation, revitalization, rebuilding. All of the work, I don't know why they're all R words, but they've become all R words that is taking place now at this time. This doesn't mean the legacy of colonization isn't with us. It's fierce and it's strong and it persists. But it also speaks to the change that is taking place, change that's seen here in this room. So this all speaks to the importance, the need, the reality that if we want to pull together, right, we have to be forming that common memory. We have to break down those silos. And to stress another point that George Erasmus makes, he says if we're not doing that, we can't build community. And it's even more than that. When we have stories that exclude that other, that remove the experience of others, it not only makes it hard to figure out how to build community, it can also become a rationalization, a justification for violence, for war. It becomes much easier to demonize or undermine or attack the person who's different than you when they don't form part of your story, when they don't form part of your understanding of who we are, why we're here, what we're doing, how we are interconnected, how we are together. This connects, I think, to some of the other work that I've done in other parts of the world. It's an interesting thing when you try to teach or write about peace, because which is something we need to do more of. But until after World War II, there wasn't really any idea of how to study peace or talk about peace. In fact, if you looked around at the time, and one very famous, very early peace philosopher after World War II, he was eager to say we need human beings to study how to build peace with one another. And he went around the world and he looked at all these universities that ostensibly studied peace. And what he discovered is what they meant by study peace was study war. Because all peace is the absence of war in their mind. And so he pushed back on this, and he came up with many ideas and constructs, and they have many different categorizations, but they're relevant to what Erasmus is talking about and what we're trying to do. And when we look at situations like in Gaza, like in the Ukraine, like in the Sudan, right, he introduced the idea that you can have hot peace and you can have cold peace. Just like you can have Cold War and you can have hot war. And one of the ideas he was saying, a hot peace is a peace where peoples are actively recognizing, building community, cohesion, interdependence, mutual understanding. Cold peace is just when we tolerate one another, right? We try to stem going to violence, but we're not making any effort to recognize, uphold, interact in a positive way with each other. Cold War, you know what it is. Hot War, what it is. His observation is, if we stay in those cold areas too long, the chance of violence and conflict rises exponentially. We can't try to manage difference. We actually have to be working to build cohesion, unity, positive interaction, mutuality. If you just try to manage those conditions, at some point they could easily implode into outright violence. Why? Because we're not doing that work, building the common memory, building the shared story, recognizing each other within ourselves. I would suggest there's all sorts of, and Anna mentioned them, structural, systemic, cultural explanations for the genocide, the war crimes, the ethnic cleansing that we see. But at its heart, you will see societies where between those peoples, that work was prevented from being done and wasn't being done. And as a result, it becomes much easier for it to explode into outright violence and destruction. That was the first. How am I doing on time? Am I running out of time? Okay? All right. That was the first practice. So remember I said how to understand our times is pulling together, pulling apart, that we're paralyzed between these forces, that we have to do a collective practice. The collective practice we have to do is build that common memory. This is work you are trying to do right here. When I hear the words Diversity Thunder Bay, when I look around this room, when I see your respect awards, when I see who you're honoring for the tremendous life that she lived, when I hear the warrior song and the prayer from Elder Selena, this is all the work of trying to build that common memory, break down the invisible silence. But the second aspect is more individual one. If we want to pull together, and I'm going to return to these Bosnian kids in a second. If we want to pull together, we have to be working from the inside out. We have to be working from the inside out. What do I mean by that? I'm going to tell a short story, which I usually use for pedagogical purposes, but it's to illustrate this inside-out point. This is from when I was in another community in the north, not the north, but north enough, north of here, anyway. And I was in a community, I was filling in for somebody who was sick. So this community didn't know me, I didn't know them. I was parachuting in, not a good situation to be in. And I was presenting to them some agreement that they had to decide on that day, that they had to examine and make a decision about, and what they were going to support it or not. And the meeting was in a old community hall, used to be a church, obviously. It had pews, and it had saloon doors at the back, like in a Western movie. And everybody was seated, the pews were full. It was mostly women and children, but the pews were filled with people. Meeting starts, I know nobody knows me. I get up. I introduce myself in my lackadaisical manner like today and, laugh a little bit. And then I start talking. About 2 minutes in, the saloon doors burst open in the back. And I can see everybody's face, right? Because it's in pews. And I can see everybody's frozen. And there's this older gentleman standing in the back, cowboy hat. I can see nobody's breathing. There was some leaders sitting behind me. They weren't going to do anything. This guy walks down the aisle, stands nose to me, rips up the paper in my hand, just stands there. I'm grateful that didn't happen today, by the way. But rips up that and stands there. Now, I could go on into the story about what I did, but that's not the purpose. The purpose of telling you that story is I want you to think about that. He might remind you of somebody across the border, by the way, in his bed, doesn't he? Right? There's something about that guy's way of thinking, something about his worldview that says that force, control, power, aggressiveness is the way to relate and the way to get what you want, right? You've probably all met people like him. You probably all know people like him who have a worldview or a mindset that says a certain type of conflict and force is the way to interact and behave in the world. You just don't stumble into this, right? This is a particular lens, a particular worldview that sure was gained over time through experiences, through teaching, through learning, through observing, through what occurred to him, that said acting that way is the way to behave. He was an extreme example, perhaps, of that kind of mindset. We're dealing with an extreme example of that kind of worldview, right? But this is what we call a conflict-oriented worldview, right? He has a worldview where conflict and violence are the easy, taken for granted choices that he's going to make. That is always going to be the default, right? That kind of person with that kind of worldview, now worldviews can change, they're dynamic. I'm not sure the guy south of the border is going to change his worldview. And as you get older in life, it's perhaps harder to. But he feels, that guy feels that is the way to act. He's always going to pull apart when he's acting in relation to his worldview. The question is, are there other worldviews? Right? This returns me to the kids in Bosnia. One of the things that occurred after that war in Bosnia is the way they stopped the outright violence, which was very brutal, was to separate everybody. They segregated everybody according to ethnic, religious background. So you had Bosniak Muslims, Serbs, Orthodox, Croats, mostly Catholic. They just pulled everyone apart. That stopped the outright violence. They quickly realized, however, that they had a problem, which is the schools in all of those areas were simply teaching the kids about how they were victims, what had been perpetrated against them, and that they had to go out and fight. And so they realized they were going to break out in outright violence just in a matter of a few years. That they lost a generation to war, but the next generation was ready to go. So what they did is they started a program that very quickly became every school in the country, all of the kids, right? The idea was we need to teach all of the kids through a worldview that reinforces the normalcy of unity, connection, and interconnection, rather than conflict and violence. And their observation was it wasn't the overt teaching of conflict and violence that was the problem. It was how we implicitly reinforce it all the time. So you think about how we teach history, and they were like, well, the way we teach kids history is it's men killing men, and then they kill men again, and then they keep doing it. That's the predominant story. How do we teach geography? Now, we're not talking about changing the facts of history, but we could also take history that looked at what happened in times where war wasn't predominant, and how it was ended, and how it was held off for a period of time, and what arts and whatever flourished, and so forth and so on. Geography, say we can teach human geography as how people were pulled together into different people's societies, realities, and beings, or we can also talk about the different ways in which they've interacted and what the positive and so forth ones are reinforced. Not changing the facts. Same thing with science. We can teach Darwinian evolution as survival of the fittest, a way that reinforces fighting and brutality, or we can teach it as complex entities coming together to form more complex entities, right? That then have more potential, more ability to create, like what Diversity Thunder Bay is doing. In a real way, right? And so their observation, so that program, which started to become the largest peace education initiative ever attempted, was teaching every school, every subject in a way that would reinforce unity-based worldviews rather than conflict-oriented worldviews. And to challenge that at every level, in every subject, in every way, right? Now, that's a very audacious, large-scale thing. But when you talk about what you're trying to do here in Diversity Thunder Bay, when you talk about diversity, when you talk about change, when you talk about building cohesion, right? One of the things you have to do is challenging people to critically self-reflect on their own worldviews. There's many people who say we should all love each other, but then their way of expressing that is through force, right? You can't say to your kids, love each other, damn it, and hope that they'll do it. No, you have to cultivate it, you have to show it, you have to reflect it, you have to reinforce it. right? We all have work to do to critically examine our own worldviews and how they reinforce. I was going to talk more about this, but I'm almost out of time. The last thing I want to say about the worldview aspect is you also have to critically self-reflect on the cultural dimensions of one's worldviews and how they reinforce certain tendencies for others. We all have worldviews that we inherit and are passed down to us based on our collective cultures, Indigenous worldviews, European descent worldviews, worldviews from other communities and peoples from around the world, and how they play into perpetuating or reinforcing the patterns of colonization and its legacy or overcoming it. But I think I need to close, so I'm just going to tie it together with one last story. Because I said there are two practices, right? I said we understand our times as pulling together, pulling apart. We have to build a common memory, a shared story. That's our collective practice. We also have to work from the inside out, critically self-reflect on our own worldviews. Well, let me end with a story of when this wasn't happening, and then close with a message about how it happens. This was a story from about 15 years ago, and it's returning to the reconciliation context. It was at a time that there was big, ambitious attempt to do something about upholding the rights of Indigenous peoples in British Columbia. It was an attempt that failed. But at the time, many Indigenous leaders, we were traveling around, I was traveling with them, supporting them, meeting business leaders, political leaders, so forth, to reinforce this change. And we had a meeting in a big tower in Vancouver with all these high, powerful business leaders about this change. And we spent 3 hours. It was a good discussion. It was robust. It was tense at times. It was getting late. We get up to leave. We're getting up to leave. And then one of the business leaders who hadn't spoken says, I need to say something. So we all sat back down and got comfortable. He said, I have to tell you something. When Section 35 of the Constitution, so this is the provision of the Constitution in 1982 that is the basis of all of the hundreds of court cases you've heard about since then, that recognizes and affirms Aboriginal rights, that is now legally transformed the landscape of Aboriginal rights in Canada. He said, when that was done, I was the Deputy Attorney General of one of the provinces. And you might remember there were standoffs about whether Indigenous rights were going to be included in the Constitution. Jody's late father was one of the leaders involved in that work. There were standoffs about it, and it was a big struggle, and the government, the former trio, finally agreed to include it. He said the night before the language of Section 35 was publicly agreed to, we all got on the phone, all the attorney generals, all the deputy attorney generals. We all got on the phone, every province, the federal government, said we all had legal opinions. He said, we all agreed Section 35 meant absolutely nothing. And he said, we all laughed, and he said, we fooled the Indians once again. Now, I tell that story, which we were all like, our jaws fell off the floor. I tell that story because he was disturbed in the moment. And I understand his disturbance. One, it was an archetype of where there hasn't been a common story, right? That this piece of Canada's history, the constitutional reform that has become a foundation of reconciliation, the story about it for the longest time has been that it was a fop, it was trying to fool, it was trying to pull a fast one, that it meant nothing, that that's what the Crown believed, that's what government believed. Also in that moment, you could see this man struggling, right? That he had, maybe sees himself now as somebody working for reconciliation, but realizing he had a conflict-oriented worldview throughout his life and the work that he had done. So just in closing, these practices, common story, invisible silos, breaking them down, working from the inside out. This term in betweener is a term that Jody framed in her previous book, True Reconciliation, that talks about individuals who are doing this. If you're breaking down those invisible silos, if you're working as you are all doing, being here today, to break those down to tell a common story, to build community in a real way. This is the work of being an in-betweener. This is the work, and she describes, this is the last words of reconciling history, which evokes back to that idea of being an in-betweener, and I'll end it here with these words. Have courage, be willing to be uncomfortable, and recognize that every contribution to shaping a more just future for Canada is a valuable and needed contribution. Building our future takes all of us. We need you, we need us, together we walk. We are one with each other, and I thank you for all you do to manifest that. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful and inspiring, and exactly what I wanted it to be. Selfishly, I hope you all felt so too. Thank you so much. We have a couple of moments, but really only a couple, to ask Dr. Danesh a few questions. This is the question microphone. We'll do it on a first come, first served basis as time allows. So if you'd like to come over, and then as you all know, there will be a book signing at the back following the Q&A. If that's still right with everybody.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was most enlightening, and I know I probably speak on behalf of most people here. Joey, please run again. This government and our institutions need the integrity that you ably demonstrated the last time. Please run again. My question has to deal with coming apart and moving apart, as you so eloquently have stated in your comment. And one of my favorite constructs is that the beauty of the rose is often protected by the thorns beneath. And your presentation brought to mind a question and a discussion that I had with my beautiful Indigenous wife, who's worked in Indigenous education all her life. About 15 years ago, there was a highly racist letter that appeared in our local newspaper, the Chronicle Journal. And I had composed, somewhat in anger, a response to it. And Beverly said, you know, the way through this is to assist that person in developing a different worldview, just as you suggested. And my response was, okay, let me temper my response by saying, look, that person has until 35 to develop a different worldview through being exposed to exactly what you've been talking about. But if he doesn't, then the best way to deal with it is to humiliate that person. I know that's a very strong word, so that he won't repeat it publicly again, because he'll be subjected to exactly what I was trying to do, which is nobody likes to be humiliated. So a very, very different view of how that letter could have been approached. And my final point is, there was a part of me that said, in my cynical aging worldview, that some of this, not all of it, a very small portion, has come by now. That we're facing the existential crisis of our time, and I'm not talking about that sociopath to the south of us. We're talking about a planet that is extremely in danger. And we know what the background of that is, and the power of the oil companies and the fossil companies to prevent anything from happening, right? So, do we have the time? The greening movement has expanded significantly, but is there enough time for that worldview to change so that the power and the money behind these corporations and the political parties that represent them can be altered so that they will have a more peaceful understanding of the future of our world for our grandchildren?
Thank you.
I'll leave it at that.
I mean, I'll just say two things very briefly on the issue of how you respond to such incidents like racist letters, which still, of course, happen all the time. I mean, maybe in between. Notice what I did in between. Pretty good, eh? In between. Maybe an in between space between the approach that you said your wife suggested versus humiliating or so forth and so on. And this is just in the abstract, but it's important to remember when we talk about things, I didn't have time to get into this, but things about unity and building cohesion. Unity is not, just getting along in some nice harmonious way. Unity can only exist in conditions where justice, certain types of just relations, are actively being built and reinforced and upheld. To say it another way, justice is in many ways a prerequisite to actually building unity. Talking about unity in the context of gross social inequalities, unfairness, and so forth is a way of reaffirming power relations that are quite unfair and uncertain. It's a way of saying, yeah, let's just all get along now, even though we've skewed everything economically, socially, and culturally. So I actually think there's ways in both, there is a place for the kind of response. I might not use the word humiliating or so forth, or use attack, but there is a way that things have to be confronted, called out, and that is part of the work of building unity in a real way. That's for a bigger discussion and so forth. Anyway, I'll leave it there on that one.
Are there any further questions, everybody, before we scurry to the back of the room? Well, then let's thank Dr. Danesh.